Welcome back for a cold Friday to end the week. What are some things you enjoy doing as recreation? What's one thing you enjoy doing as recreation? Nobody has anything they like doing? Watching sports. Yeah, that's good. Something else?
Dancing.
Dancing. All right. Others?
Going to the beaches.
Going to the beaches? Yeah. When it's warm, of course. I don't think you've enjoyed it right now. But. Others? Why is it we enjoy doing those things? What is it about it that we enjoy? In an overall sense, not maybe the specific thing of whatever it is we specifically enjoy. Why is it we do those things?
Just makes you happy.
Makes you happy, right? Satisfies you. It helps us, give some enjoyment to life. That life is not all perhaps work and struggle, right? It can be a means to celebrate. We don't want everything to be necessarily ordinary. We like to celebrate. Well, just simple things such as celebrating the fact that today is Friday. The work week is over. We're getting into the weekend. We can relax a little bit after having done a bunch. Hopefully, as long as our weekend isn't too busy. So we have to though strike a balance with all of these things. All play and no work is not good for Jack. Just as all work and no play is just as bad. There has to be a balance between all these things. Our duties, our obligations, but also our recreation, our rest. The best way that we can see in looking at this is looking at substances that people use that help them to recreate or to relax. Of course, the big one that's been used throughout the centuries, the millennia, alcohol, right? People have enjoyed alcohol for literally millennia. We have recipes for alcoholic drinks from ancient Sumeria and ancient Babylonian civilizations. They say supposedly good stuff, but no, they haven't let me try. The difficulty in dealing with a substance like alcohol is that it can have an immense effect on our personal being. What are some of the ways that people talk about how alcohol affects us?
Alcoholism, which can kind of wreck your life.
Becoming addicted, absolutely. Others? Yeah. Impairment, right? Yeah, long-term abuse of it can have detrimental health effects, right? It can cause us to be unable, looking at the impairment angle, we're not able to make right decisions. Right? We're not able to act with our full faculties so that we can make proper, prudent decisions about how to act. This is, of course, why there's the campaign against driving while drunk or driving even while buzzed, right? It severely impacts your reaction times. It severely impacts your judgment abilities. Yet people continue to enjoy it. And of course, though, some people argue whether it's a good thing for people to enjoy it or not. The phrase perhaps too much of a good thing comes to mind. So in trying to start applying some of the things that we've learned and talked about, especially the virtues of temperance and prudence, it's great to see how we can begin to do this in the case of the use of things that we enjoy, and especially ones that can have an adverse side effect as well. It's one thing to try to regulate how much we watch sports or Netflix. It's another try to understand and regulate something like this, something that can be enjoyed and is enjoyed properly by people, but can be and is abused by others. We can often perhaps look at how we deal with alcohol in the perspective of the morality of obligation. Remember those two perspectives? Obligation versus what's the other one? I'd have to throw that on the participation assignment. Morality of obligation versus what's the other morality? What is the one thing we truly want? Happiness. Right? Morality of happiness. Looking at it from the first perspective, the morality of obligation, will say that we obey laws concerning alcohol because we need to, either because we need approval, perhaps for monetary reasons, perhaps for circumstantial reasons, that we may restrict or limit our use of it for the way that I don't affect others, but others do not affect me as well. Yet looking at it from the perspective of morality of happiness would say we can see a virtuous way of using it. That there can be found some bit of felicitas, of temporary happiness, not, of course, the eternal happiness, the beatitudo. There can be a thing as virtuous drinking. Remember, we talked about virtue being kind of in balancing all things, not too much, not too little. There can be the virtuous, good use of alcohol. Now, this, of course, is a subject often debated among various Christians. Why? There are many variant opinions about the use or the ability to use alcohol in any way. Some Christian denominations will say it should not be used at all. That it and offer biblical reasons or rational reasons. Others will talk about other methods of allowing it in some circumstances. And the biggest reason why is because of the effect alcohol has on the person. Now, what happens when one consumes enough of it, not too much, and just even enough of it? It begins to alter our mind. It begins to affect our capacities. We talked about that before. Beginning to slow the reaction time, beginning to remove some of the inhibitions of the person. Even for those who are in the state they call buzzed, you've had not enough that you can't remember, but that you've still had more than just maybe one or two glasses. Now, of course, what is the big difficulty in dealing with alcohol? Yeah.
It wouldn't be that it's like it's different for everyone.
Number one, it's different for everyone. Yes. First of all, different ethnicities and even different people react differently. They often used fire water to try to weaken the Native Americans, the Indians, as they were coming through. It's still a very rampant problem on many reservations, alcoholism, where many of them will not even when they are not allowed to buy alcohol, they will find other means, like rubbing alcohol. Whereas others, there are other people who are able to tolerate a lot without it really affecting them. So this is one of the difficulties that can be had of trying to issue rounds of temperance, right? What may be the limit for me may not be the limit for you. Yours may be less. Yours may be higher. There. For some people, they can only handle 2 ounces of a particular alcohol. Others may be able to handle 16. Another part of that as well, the variety in alcohol, right? Different things have different amounts of alcohol. Beer and wine are quite different. The various spirits, bourbons, whiskeys, vodkas. 16 ounces of one type of alcohol may have less alcohol than something that's only 3 ounces, but it's more concentrated. So we have to be prudent and aware of that as well. Different things affect the body in different ways also. So in looking at the question of the right or good use, or the possible right or good use of a substance like alcohol, we need to look at 2 of the parts of a free intentional act. What's the first part that we talked about? 3 parts of a free intentional act. What was the first one? Intention, right?
Object.
An object is the other one we'll look at. What's the third? Circumstances, correct. So we need to, we need to first look into the intention of the person committing this act. Why is it they are drinking? Why is it they are consuming this? Intention is a big part of how we judge free intentional acts, and then to judge them in a moral perspective. But we must also look at how they do it, the actual act, the object of the act itself. Their intention may be to just relax, to just enjoy themselves. But if they are doing keg stands, that's still rather immoral and imprudent. I'm not going to explain what a keg stand is. Look it up online. No, I have not done it either, so don't be throwing rumors around either. Why we do something affects the moral weight of it just as much as what we do. We may exercise some prudence, but if we are abusing the substance, as those who become addicted to alcohol do, we may drink in a reasonable or rational way, time period or whatnot, but they are still abusing it. So we talked before in defining temperance. Temperance became a key word for the use of alcohol in the United States, at least, at the turn of the 20th century. Many various groups strove, calling themselves temperance leagues, strove to try to limit the use of alcohol. Why? Because they felt it ruined families, it ruined homes, it ruined lives. Of various groups, whether Christian or not Christian, Protestant and Catholic, many of these groups, many of them at various different levels, but a growing sentiment emerged of saying alcohol is so terrible, we need to ban it. And so they passed an entire amendment to the Constitution. 18th, if I remember correctly. 18th or 19th, I can't remember which one.
It was the 19th because the 21st was the repeal.
I knew the 21st. I always get 18th or 19th.
It was two before whatever the repeal was.
19th would be. So they passed that amendment, I want to say 1919, something like that, and began to introduce a period known as, in American history, as Prohibition. Right? It became illegal to consume or make alcohol for recreational purposes. The only way it was allowed was either for religious uses. So, for example, in the Catholic Mass, alcoholic wine is used, not grape juice or not a non-alcoholic substance, but something that has alcohol in it, or even medicinal purposes. There have been medicinal reasons for using various types of alcohol or alcohol-based medicines. How did this go down? How many of you know your early 20th century history? What's that?
They just did it legally.
Bingo.
Farmers just made a lot of money.
Well, it gave rise to massive amounts of crime. People, for example, started making their own, what they would sometimes call bathtub gins, because they literally make it in their bathtub, which led to the deaths of some people. Because some people, if you get it mixed wrong, you get it too strong, too much alcohol too quickly kills you. Straight up kills you. It'll have some adverse effects before that, but it will kill you. If you mix things wrong, it may become something far different and far deadlier than even basic alcohol. It also gave rise to organized crime, the mobs, the mafia. Who's the great criminal figure of the Prohibition era? Al Capone, right? He made his money by running booze. For the more elite classes, they began to organize illegal bars, illegal groups called speakeasies. If you knew the code, if you knew the password, you could get in and enjoy something. Hence why the period of Prohibition didn't even last 15 years. The 21st Amendment is the only amendment so far that repeals an entire other amendment, not just a part of it, but completely eradicates that. Now, however, there are still many local restrictions in various areas. For example, here in the state of Kentucky, over half of the counties in the state still do not allow the sale or distribution of alcohol within their boundaries. How many of you knew that?
Doesn't sound like it were considering it'd be like a 30-minute drive to school.
Well, there can be some arguments about that, right? But there are a lot of the southern and more mountainous counties in the state. So not around here, not in the north. But there are various laws. So there are plenty of dry counties. Sorry, yes.
Yeah, London, Kentucky was a dry county like my entire childhood.
Mm-hmm. I think technically only the city is actually wet. So see, things like that. There have been a lot of changes in the past 20 years or so in a lot of areas as there has been much growth and a lot of expansion, and brought with it, more people maybe from areas that have looser liquor laws. So places have changed, either whole counties or sometimes cities. So most of those, looking at it, most of those are dry counties. They're called. There is no alcohol sold there, or it's not done legally, so it's called a dry county. Where you can buy it are called wet counties. So we are in Kenton County, one of the 120 counties of Kentucky. It is considered a wet county. It is legal and permissible for businesses to sell alcohol, not just restaurants, but stores as well. There are in-between conditions, areas that are called moist. They are called that because they allow restaurants of certain sizes to sell alcohol. They don't allow stores, so you can't go to your Walmart or your Kroger or whatever your particular grocery store is. You can't go in there and buy alcohol, but you can go to your Applebee's or your Fridays and you can buy an alcoholic drink there. Yes?
Some counties allow it, just not on Sundays. That's more of I think that used to be called the blue laws. Some don't allow it to be sold on Sunday. Some used to not even allow it before 12 or 1. I think that even used to be the case here. I think recently it's gotten to about 11 or maybe 10 on Sunday. Yeah. Recently, 2019, when I was working in Walgreens, it was still new in county at least.
Okay. Yeah, I thought it was pretty recent. On another way, if elections are being held, no bars have to be closed. And I don't believe liquor is allowed to be sold before a certain time, before like the polls close. In some other places, they allow some freedom. So they'll allow golf courses or certain fraternal organizations, or even they have wineries or distilleries that are there. Even though the rest of the county does not allow it, you can go on that premise and either buy it or at least to consume it, to buy and consume legally. So this is still something that is a very contentious issue, perhaps not on the national level, but very much on the local level. And even who can consume it is an immense question. So what's the legal age for drinking in the United States?
21.
21, right? That only happened in the 80s. Before the 80s, many states had different laws. Some had it as low as 18, or said those between 18 and 21 could buy some certain types of beer. My dad, growing up in the 70s and the 80s up in Ohio, talked about often, people
anyone that age could buy what they called 3-2 beer, which was a lower level alcoholic beer. It wasn't as high as the regular beer. But a campaign in the early 80s by MAD, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, got the federal government to pressure the states into making the law 21. They didn't pass it in Congress. What they did was they didn't pass it completely in Congress. What they did was they tied it to an incentive for interstate funds. The interstate is funded not by the state, but by the federal government. So if states raised their law to 21, they basically got a bonus for their interstate funds. So by about I want to say about 85 or 86, most of the states by their own assemblies and governments had raised the legal age of drinking to 21. Yeah.
So there's no federal law on that? Like it's
I do not believe technically, no, there is not. Those are all state laws. But they're all now, basically every state now is 21.
I know a few states that have rules where you can't get alcohol, say like with your parents or on your property or something.
Well, most of them, this is the legal age for, it can be either legal age for purchasing or consuming. I think it's universally for consuming, not, like you said, not necessarily purchasing. I think there's some that still gives some leeway for purchasing. So I don't want to talk too generally here about it, but what about in Europe? You know what most of the legal drinking ages are in Europe?
Some of them as low as 16.
Yeah,
Places like Italy and Germany have none because of the culture.
exactly. Many places don't even have a technical legal age. Now others, it's as low as 16. So culture, background can very much influence the perspective on what is a good temperance policy. Some are too much. Some may be allowing it too much. But that is ultimately something that is decided by the governments at their appropriate level. We'll talk about subsidiarity later on. What, though, is the Christian position on the use of alcohol? Well, we have to understand there are three different ways of looking at how to treat something such as alcohol. So these three Christian positions on the use of substances. The first, the most lenient, you could say, is, of course, moderation. That in the topic of alcohol, one is allowed to use it, but to use it to appropriate levels. In more ancient, in medieval scholarship, in talking about this, the phrase that was often used to understand, what was one's limit of alcohol was reaching the point ad hilaritatem, to the point of hilarity. The one gets a little bit more giddy, one gets a little bit looser. Going beyond that point was using it to excess. So moderation is using it up to this point. It is immoderate to go past it. So in a certain sense, you could say you get a free pass once to be able to know your limit, but then you can't go beyond that. Now, of course, though, our bodies change over time, right? So we may not be able to take in as much if we're older. So that point may change. We have to be aware of that. This position of moderation says we need to be aware of what is moderate. We shouldn't, not strive ever closer, oh, I'm going to go only this far or, only that far. We know what our limit is, but we maintain within it. So that's moderation. That's kind of the widest position. The next position is abstention. In this position, the individual chooses not to partake of the substance. So others may drink, but I may choose not to drink. So it is not something that affects others. It is a personal choice I make for myself. Most recovering alcoholics take up this position, right? They abstain from themselves. They don't necessarily prohibit those around them. They may change their company, of course. But they don't use it themselves. But then comes the bigger one, and this is the policy idea of prohibition. And yes, exactly like the period that we were talking about earlier. It is not an individual choice. It is a choice that a community makes to prohibit this substance from being used. To say that for certain reasons, moral, biblical, religious, even rational, this should not be used, and therefore we must keep it away. Not just make it personally, but to not allow it within our community, whether religious or non-religious communities. So these are kind of the three various Christian positions of temperance with substances like this, from the most laid back, moderation, kind of the middle ground, abstention, to the more extreme of prohibition. In looking at this in a specifically Catholic perspective, not just a generally Christian, but a specifically Catholic perspective, the position of the Catholic use of alcohol is between the top two, moderation and abstention. That one must use it moderately. One can also, is free to use it, to not use it, I should say. But it's with something like this, to avoid the idea of prohibition. Why? Because there is nothing inherently wrong with the moderate use of alcohol. And in fact, there are studies that emerge, although there seem to be studies of every position. There are often studies that say the moderate use of certain alcohol can have a health benefit. They say moderate use of wine can be good for the heart. How much defines moderate? It depends on the study. So, other Christian denominations, other Christian groups can often lean further down. More fundamental groups, like some branches of Baptists, Pentecostals, for example, lean towards prohibition. Hence, why we talked earlier about those areas in Kentucky, for example, that are dry. They're dry because they have large Christian communities that say we should prohibit it. It is a danger. The big thing in dealing with things like alcohol, these things are not in themselves absolutely necessary to live, are they? Do we need alcohol? Pretty much no. There, like I said, there can be argued some of the medicinal uses, and it can help in times maybe when we're sick. But when we're healthy, we do not need it. It is not absolutely essential for everyday health. But it is something that brings joy and delight to people. Used moderately, of course. In Psalm 104, the psalmist praises wine. He talks about what God gives wine to gladden the human heart. The Catholic positions of moderation and abstention are in part because of interpreting and understanding some of the very actions of Jesus Christ. In the second book of John, second chapter of the Gospel of John, Jesus transforms water into wine. And we know it's wine, by the way, because the head waiter goes to the bridegroom after Jesus performs this miracle. And he talks about, he says, this is at a wedding feast. So this is a grand party, just like many wedding parties involving alcohol. And the head waiter says to the bridegroom, he says, most people usually save the good stuff for the beginning and then put out mediocre stuff. Why is that? Because people are not as perceptive of taste and they just want to enjoy at a certain point. If you've been to a Catholic wedding, you understand that. That's wine. That's not grape juice. Grape juice doesn't do that. In fact, Jesus partakes in the Passover meal, which uses wine as well. The Catholic Mass is derived from the Last Supper of Jesus, where he uses bread and wine. So wine in and of itself is not evil. It is our abuse of it, ultimately. It is our abuse of alcohol that is evil, that is immoral. If we are moderate or if we abstain from it, we are not immoral. We are still able to act as we should. Now, how does this differ from the other things that people consume? How does this differ from drugs? Can we apply all of this that we just talked about with alcohol? Can we apply it with drugs, or must we use a different standard? Yes and no. First, we must understand the difference between these two things and just what they even are. Most regular alcoholic products are regular foodstuffs. They started out as things that were meant for the consumption, regular consumption by human beings. Who started beer? Anybody know the history of beer? There is some argument of some ancient forms of beer, but the kind of the beers that we know and have now, you're right, come from Catholic monks. Why? They started it because the 40 days before Easter are a period of penance. So normally fasting from regular meals. To help with that, many of the monks began to devise this drink that they would consume instead of or in lieu of a meal, so as to give them some nourishment, but not to be as filling, quote unquote, as a regular meal, so they could still be fasting some. The side effect was, they basically kind of made bread water, putting grains and stuff together, letting it ferment. The side effect of that fermentation was it produces alcohol. So they began to notice, in consuming this, that if they would consume too much, it would have a crazy effect on them. Whereas, I'm sorry.
Was there any way that they used like that attempt earlier of like the apple area to where like they kind of realize like if they start getting a little tipsy that maybe I've had too much in terms of like for the fasting they were doing?
Well, they eventually, they began to eventually understand that as they would use it, they perhaps probably thought at first it was maybe the effects of fasting, not getting as much, and but then they would probably continue consuming it even after fasting, so even with some meals, and probably that's how they began to realize it's something in here, in the beer, that is causing that, not just my lack of food or whatnot. In fact, the lack of food would make it worse. Now, of course, they didn't devise it to have a large amount of alcohol, and that was a side effect when they used it. Now we've kind of, we can tweak beer some, just like we can tweak other alcohols, how much alcohol it has in it. So the difference with drugs those are natural substances. So while we can consume natural substances, they are not things that we normally consume. We normally only consume them in time of need. So normally many of these things are drugs in the medicinal meaning, that they help us when we are sick, or if we have some sort of infirmity. So for example, I'm diabetic. I have various drugs that I take to help maintain my insulin and how well my body processes carbohydrates and sugars, so that it's not too much and it's not too little. So, foodstuffs, the way that we can distinguish how these two are able to be used is looking at their ordinary use. The ordinary use of foodstuffs is for our nourishment. The ordinary use of these natural substances is not an everyday use. It is particular circumstances or particular needs. How do these things affect us in their ordinary use? Foodstuffs do not have an ordinary impairing effect. There is no impairment in the ordinary use of foodstuffs. And yes, that includes alcohol. For foodstuffs, the impairing use is when it goes beyond the ordinary. So if you eat too much, it's very hard to operate, isn't it? You have to lay down, you have to lay out and whatnot. So it impairs you in some way. If you eat ordinarily, you eat enough, not too much, it does not impair you. You're able, right? You're going to hopefully go grab lunch at some point today and then go on with your day. It's not going to stop you from doing your stuff, doing whatever you need to do. That is even true in the case of alcohol. We can use it in an ordinary context for our culinary enjoyment, but it doesn't have an impairing effect as long as it's done in moderation. These drugs, these natural substances, more often than not in their ordinary use, have an effect of impairment on us. In particular, of course, those that are taken to have some effect on our psyche. What are some drugs like that? That have an immense psychological effect on us. What's one?
Some things like the psychedelic mushrooms.
Yeah, mushrooms, which are a natural substance, right? Others that are maybe more manufactured nature.
LSD.
LSD, yes. Others.
Amphetamines.
Amphetamines. What's the big one everyone's been fighting for the past few years, at least in this area?
Heroin.
Herbs, heroin, more heroin than that, but yeah, both of those. Herbs, heroin's the big one. Cocaine was that for the longest time. I don't think that one's as big anymore. I think heroin's the bigger one. What's the one everyone argues about whether its use is fine or not? The big M. Mary Jane, right? Marijuana. The argument over whether it can be comparable to smoking or not. But yet anything that falls in this category, and yes, we do place in Catholic morality marijuana in this category, have an impairing effect from their ordinary use. Not above and beyond, but their ordinary use. That in some way it detrimentally affects our rational capacities. To different degrees, some immensely, some minimally. Which is hence why things that fall in this category, in a Catholic moral perspective, are seen to only be used when needed. So I won't go so far as necessarily to say prohibition, but to say, only to be used when needed. Why? Because ultimately what's lost here is freedom. This impairment becomes a renunciation of freedom, giving up of one's freedom for the enjoyment one receives from all of this. We'll wrap up a little bit more on Monday. So read up on, we'll finish up talking about that and then look into Chapter 7, Justice, on Monday. So read up on that. Be sure to take the participation assignment will be posted soon. It will be posted by noon. So be sure to get that done. That'll be due by the end of the day on Monday. So get that done and we'll see you on